IVM.
There was this wonderful lampooning of Iqbal's Tarana-e-Hind, which is Sare Jahan Se Achha Hindustan Hamara. And he said, Chino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Rehne ko ghar nahi hai, Sara Jahan Hamara. And basically the song is being sung by Raj Kapoor. You know, he's looking for a place to sleep on the footpath in the night in Bombay City. And, you know, that's why he's saying, Rehne ko ghar nahi hai, but we are saying Sara Jahan Hamara. You know, जितनी भी बिल्डिंगें थी सेठों ने बांट ली है फुटपाथ बंबई के हैं आशिया हमारा.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast. We have with us today a person with a very eclectic career graph. Akshay Manwani is the author of two very interesting books. One is Sahir Ludhianvi, The People's Poet, and Music, Masti, Modernity, the Cinema of Nasir Hussain. He's also a part-time journalist and someone who's been writing for the better part of his life. And he is also someone you will hear a lot in the coming season of NBA as a commentator, as you might have in the previous seasons. And if that was not enough, Akshay is also a wildlife photographer. But interestingly, he likes to sign off like he did in the jacket of his book on Nasir Hussain as a full-time homemaker. Welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast, Akshay.
Thanks, Karthik. That's such a glowing introduction. It's all those hats are worn by me. I'm guilty as charged.
Very, very, very exciting. I suspect the discussion will move more towards the books. Considering my knowledge on both wildlife photography as well as the NBA is fairly limited, though I can talk about San Antonio Spurs for a fairly longish time. But starting off with the book on Sahir, Akshay, even though you've never mentioned it to me, I suspect it's the book that's probably closer to you. It's just my suspicion of the two.
Well, of course, it was my first book, so, you know, sometimes I just wonder that, you know, how did I do it? How did I manage to do it?
Right.
But I mean, it took 5 years to get, you know, from when I started to when it got published, 2009 to 2013.
But at what point, and just to set the perspective for the listeners, at this point you're writing both on sports as well as on cinema, on many websites. At what point did you want to write a book on Sahir Ludhianvi?
So I was doing this, you know, I had been commissioned to write these profiles of cinematic personalities for this website, now defunct website called Film Nirvana. And, you know, my editor sent me this entire list of film lyricists that I had to sit down and write short profiles of. And, you know, so when I started writing and actually researching about them, Koffee Azmi, Majroo Sultanpuri, Janisar Akhtar, Shailendra, I was like, I know their songs, but I don't know who these people are. Like, you know, every time one heard a Hindi song on our FM channels or on All India Radio, I always remember the music composer and the playback singer being mentioned. I don't have any memory of the lyricist name being mentioned alongside.
Right.
And, you know, in my home, my father is a big Hindi film buff. In fact, I always say that, you know, my love for the NBA came from my, you know, in a sense, from within me. My love for wildlife came from my mother, and my love for Hindi cinema came from my dad.
Oh,
so
wow.
it was like, you know, all three, you know, kind of contributing towards all my, interests. But even when my dad spoke to me about old Hindi film songs, or he sat down to listen to old Hindi film songs, even he never knew or mentioned the lyricists. So when I started reading up on these lyricists, my first idea, actually, to be honest with you, was like, you know, doing a book on, let's say, 4 or 5 top lyricists of the 50s and 60s. But, you know, just once I started reading about Sahir, that story of his life just lent itself so beautifully to a biography that I said that, you know, this is the guy I should focus on rather than doing a mishmash of 5 personalities and writing about each one of them.
Right. And it's such a great subject for a book, like you said, right? Like you mentioned about how you don't listen to the lyricist's name.
Yes.
But he's one of the strongest advocates that All India Radio should also announce the lyricist's name when they're...
Absolutely. Back in the day, he I believe he went to the INB minister at that time. Right. I don't remember the person's name, but he said this, that if you're mentioning the playback singer's name and you're mentioning the composer's name, you're mentioning the film's name, why shouldn't the lyricist be mentioned?
Right.
And the INB minister apparently agreed, and from then on they did start mentioning the lyricist's name on air.
And he's probably the reason why we get to listen to that
he
today.
was that kind of person. There is a story that goes about him that he at one point in time he had a falling out with Lata Mangeshkar also, who was like...
I was going to come to this much later in the conversation. In fact, both the subjects of both your books are extremely nepotistic, if I can say. But Sahir, and I don't know, I know the story, but I know the background. Maybe you can help us understand this. He demanded at some point that he needed 1 rupee more than Lata Mangeshkar.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Yes. Apparently, this was all about, pride and self-respect for him. So if you look at the trinity of people who work on a song, there is the composer, there is the playback singer, and there is the lyricist. Okay. And in that trinity of these, technicians who work on delivering a song in a film, it's primarily the music composer who calls the shots, and this is, I'm talking about 50s, 60s, up till the 70s, right? But what used to happen with people like Lata Mangeshkar, Kishore Kumar, Mohammad Rafi is that they were such big personalities that some of them were like, the composers kind of, also were happy to, pay them what they asked for. But the lyricist was always the third person in this power
was
structure.
Least amongst the equal.
In fact, the composers would determine what the lyricist would get paid. But Sahir is one of those rare lyricists, like, he even despite his ego issues with composers like S.D. Burman or O.P. Nayyar, he never worked with Shankar Jaikishan. Despite all that, he said that I'm happy to work with composers who are not as commercially acclaimed. So like he worked a lot with people like Roshan, with Khayyam Saab.
Rajesh Roshan.
No, this is Rajesh Roshan's father.
Okay, understood.
Okay, Roshan. So Roshan had 2 sons, Rakesh Roshan and Rajesh Roshan. So he worked with them, and he gave them some of their biggest hits in life. So he was the one who could call the shots and tell a producer or a filmmaker, a director, that I will work with this composer. So in that entire battle for pride and all that, once he got to know, the story goes that he got to know that Lata Mangeshkar would get paid so much, he said that I'm going to charge a rupee more than her. It was nothing but a battle
but not Rafi, not Hemant Kumar, just Lata Mangeshkar.
Perhaps because she was the highest paid playback singer at that time.
Right.
I mean, if you think about a great song from the 1950s or the 1960s, it is Lata's voice that comes to mind immediately. So, whereas Rafi and Kishore are, you'd probably think of Rafi's, greatest era being between, let's say, 1950 to 1965, and then, Kishore Kumar from 1967 till the mid-80s. But Lata is like, the omnipresent.
One constant across all of this.
For close to, 4 decades. From the mid-40s to the, pretty much till the mid-80s.
It's the beauty and the tragedy of this industry.
Yes,
we have to listen to just one voice in a country of billions, but I digress. That's for a separate show altogether. But, the more I think sometime back, I probably saw a play on Sahir's life also.
Right. Ek Mulaqat, I think.
I think so,
Okay.
Yeah. It's not even his real name, isn't it? This is his pen name. Because he's from Ludhiana.
Yes, his real name was Abdul Hai. And there is a story that goes that, his father was this, kind of very despotic, if you look back at the old Hindi films of the 50s and 60s, you'll have this, kind of zamindar, kind of villainous figure. In fact, in my book, I say that, if you look at a film like Madhubati, where, Pran plays this diabolical zamindar figure, that was Sahir's father, basically. Very, there are horror stories about him. In fact, Sahir's mother was apparently his 12th or 13th wife. And he had no children from the earlier wives, and this was his first child from his 12th or 13th wife, and he was really badly behaved. There's a story that he used to kind of curse out his neighbor every evening. He would get drunk and he would curse out his neighbor, and that neighbor's name was also Abdul Hai.
Oh.
And when Abdul Hai, the neighbor, would come and, say that, why are you abusing me? Why are you cussing me so loudly in the neighborhood? He said, no, I'm not cussing you. I'm shouting at my son. So, because son was also Abdullah. So Sahir wanted to, kind of escape from that. After his mother separated from his father, he made a conscious effort to, kind of rid himself of all that, that he associated with his dad. And one of the things was that he also wanted to change his name. He was getting into poetry. He understood that, poets need what is called a takhallus in Urdu, a pen name. So he was reading this couplet from the poet called Iqbal, and he ran upon these lines where he discovered this word Sahir, which basically means magician. And he said, in the context of that poem, it was basically that I am one such magician amongst many. So he said, this kind of suits. I'm also, trying to be a poet, one amongst many out there. So let me take Sahir as my name. And then because he was from Ludhiana, so Ludhianvi came in and he started being known as Sahir Ludhianvi.
And I see a lot of contradictions and sort of tragedies in his life. Right?
Yes.
His personal life is very layered as well. There are a lot of people who were in love with him, who he was in love with, but never really consummated that at any level.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But what is, when you finish the book and now, what is Sahir for you? What kind of a person is he for you?
Well, like you said, it's almost like, you're dealing with someone who had this kind of very strange split personality. On one hand, here is a man who, like you said, some of his poems are just so romantic, If you just think of the song Jo Wada Kiya Wo Nibhana Padega from Taj Mahal, or you think of Jaane Wo Kaise Log The Jinke Pyar Ko Pyar Mila, the song from Waqt, Aage Bhi Jaane Na Tu, and on the other hand, none of the relationships were like, taken to their logical conclusion, to the institution of marriage. Right. So Amrita Pritam, in her own autobiography, Rasidi Ticket, she writes that, our relationship was a relationship of silence. That's how she defined it. And I would, stare at him and he would stare at me from, the corner of the road. He would be looking up at the window to my home. And it was that kind of a strange relationship. And in fact, Amrita Pritam's partner, her partner for the last 40 years of her life, a man called Imroz, a lovely man called Imroz, told me, he said that, the thing about him was that he was just happy that, he and Amrita were just happy to know each other. Why they didn't take it to any logical conclusion, his guess was that because he had such a strong mother presence in his life, that he was so indebted to his mother for separating from his father and then having to raise him burdened with parental responsibilities all by herself, that he wasn't willing to kind of divide his love with anyone else. So it's his poetry is also, every poem of his which talks about a failed romance or unrequited love, it also talks about that, he's requesting his lover that, you don't worry, you don't be unhappy. I have the sorrows of the world to concern myself with.
Right.
So on one hand, there is this very strong love for the mother. But at the same time, I also felt that he was very conflicted with his concern for, human empathy, pain and suffering, injustice for the poor, marginalized, weaker sections of society. So very, very conflicted.
And that comes out very strongly, right? Like I think he moved from Lahore to India because he was accused of sedition. He was seen as a communist. Is that correct?
Well, there is a great question that was asked of him that, are you a progressive writer? If I remember this correctly, are you a progressive writer because you are a communist? And he says that, just because I think the reply was that, what makes you say that? Because something on the lines of that, just because I've worn a shirt, it doesn't mean that I'm a gentleman or something on those lines.
Right.
So he says, if you state anything that you see happening around you with honesty, you get bracketed, that he's a communist because he's expressing what he's seeing factually and honestly.
Right.
I'm only doing that. Now, if society decides to bracket me as a communist, I can't help that. So he was that kind of person.
You mentioned progressive, and I think recently when I was researching something else, I ended up reading a lot about the Progressive Writers Association.
Yes.
That was formed largely in today's Pakistan.
Yes, in Lahore.
In Lahore.
In 1935. And basically there were these, I forget their names, but there was this book called Angare which was published, which was, I think, a collection of stories. And they were basically, these stories were, kind of tackling taboo subjects, and subjects which were not discussed or spoken of, and much less in literature. So that kind of was the spark to the progressive writers movement, and the man who kind of is known as having started it was Sajjad Zahir. And the idea or the premise behind the progressive writers movement was that art cannot be for art's sake alone. It has to have a larger responsibility. And that larger responsibility is that you give hope to the common man. You talk about the issues that are facing him. You discuss the injustices, the problems that they face every day at the hands of the bourgeois and, the more privileged sections of society.
Right.
And at the end of the day, you have to also give them hope. So, there were a number of writers and poets who got associated with the progressive writers movement. And, this is what, if one just takes a tangential view, I think this is a problem currently in Indian society, that the intellectuals are not reaching the masses. Whereas back then, through the progressive writers movement, some of the biggest names in literature were able to connect with the masses. When people like Majroo Saab, Mulk Raj Anand, Sahir, Koffee Azmi, they traveled. If you read Sajjad Zahir's account of the progressive writers movement, they were going to places beyond the metro cities. What are the metro cities today? They were traveling to internal parts of Maharashtra, Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, a number of places. There were conferences organized in Lucknow, in what is now Pakistan, in the eastern part of the country, across the length and breadth of the country. They were, and those mushairas, those meetings were attended by the common man. So it was not just a writer sitting.
These are the days before the Lit Fest.
Yes,
which is pretty much where you see them today.
Yes, which is where you see them, and they're basically engaging with an anglicized, anglophone audience. They're not engaging with the common man.
Yeah, but of course they also had more bandwidth of the common man back then. But completely agree with you. I think Ismat Chugta and a few other, Mulk Raj Anand and a few others were also part of the
absolutely.
Of this,
Munshi Premchand, the preeminent name in Hindi literature, was one of the persons who kind of drafted and stated the objectives of the progressive writers movement. So many of them, Ismat Chugtai, Sadat Hasan Manto, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Krishan Chandar, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, who became synonymous with Raj Kapoor's films, all of them were engaging. It was not just, a piece of literature which was written for some magazine which was being read by a few hundred people and that's it.
Yeah. But coming back to Sahir, he's also very conflicted and very strong in his opinions, right? Like,
yes.
I mean, as a fan, I got to know of his writings first. When I looked him up,
yes.
It was after I saw Pyasa, and that's when I started reading about him, with more intent. But one thing that strikes me is if you go to his relationship with his other peers, right? Whether it is S.D. Burman, with whom I think he split ways after Pyasa.
Yes.
And there's one other incident I was reading where he said it should not be Shankar Jaikishan scoring music for a particular film which was based on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
Yes, Fir Subah Hogi.
Right.
Yes.
And then he said Khayyam, who understands the book better, should
actually,
probably...
Yes, and this was something that Khayyam Saab, rest in peace, told me himself. He said that when Ramesh Sehgal, who was the director of Fir Subah Hogi, approached Sahir to write the lyrics of the film, Sahir asked him, who are the composers? He said, well, I have Raj Kapoor playing the lead, so it's going to be Shankar Jaikishan because Raj Kapoor only works with Shankar Jaikishan as composers. Right. So Sahir apparently told him that I don't have a problem with Shankar Jaikishan. I've never worked with them, but I would rather that you take someone who has read Crime and Punishment and understood it. Right. In Khayyam Saab's own words, जिन्होंने पढ़ा हो और समझा हो. Right, and Khayyam Saab's voice was, it just the tone, the ring, the tenor, that very remark, I can never forget it. So he took great pride in the fact that Sahir mentioned his name because he understood the text, the message in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And again, here was a composer who had worked in a few films before Fir Subah Hogi, but none of them had done well commercially. It was Fir Subah Hogi which kind of put Khayyam Saab's name out there in the industry as a composer of repute. In fact, my own, every time you do a book on cinema, or at least well, I've done 2 books on cinema and not like a dozen. But there is a film that you will discover, you know. And for me, the discovery was Fir Subah Hogi. And I personally think that, yes, Pyasa is Sahir's preeminent album, but there is nothing that I would lead me to believe that Fir Subah Hogi is in any ways second fiddle or number 2. It's as good. On another day, I might even say this, that it is better than Pyasa.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the songs were far more scathing. They were far more scathing. You know, he is indulging in, you know, what would be called blasphemous. You know, आसमां पे है खुदा और ज़मीं पे हम, आजकल वो इस तरफ देखता है कम. You know, this kind of writing, I think, would surely land him in trouble today. You know, there would be immediately a fatwa put out, you know, that he's questioning Khuda and, you know, that kind of language. You don't see that kind of writing anymore.
Right.
There was this wonderful lampooning of Iqbal's Tarana-e-Hind, which is Sare Jahan Se Achha Hindustan Hamara. And he said, Chino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Rehne ko ghar nahi hai, Sara Jahan Hamara. And basically the song is being sung by Raj Kapoor. You know, he's looking for a place to sleep on the footpath in the night in Bombay City. And, you know, that's why he's saying, Rehne ko ghar nahi hai, but we are saying Sara Jahan Hamara. You know, jitni bhi buildinge thi, Setho ne baat li hai, footpath Bombay ke hai aashiyan hamara.
Wow.
So, you know, that kind of, you know, there is a cop who comes into the song, as in the way it is picturized, and he says, Jebe hai apni khali, deta kyun varna gali, wo santari hamara, wo pasba hamara. So, you know, again, the way the song was picturized, the kind of lyrics, that movie, like every song is a gem.
Even
song.
as a film, it has not been widely talked about.
I have begged, you know, amateur film historians, film bloggers to go and watch Ramesh Sehgal's Fir Subah Hogi. I think it's one of those underrated gems from the 1950s, which is waiting to be rediscovered.
Amazing. On that wonderful note, we'll take a very short break.
Sure.
And when we come back, we'll talk about Akshay's next book, which is on Nasir Hussain and also his journey with basketball.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Family businesses get a bad rap. At one time, they were looked down on for getting rich, for being too ambitious. Today, they're still looked down on, but for not being ambitious enough. Not agile enough, not modern enough, too traditional in their mindset. The biggest brands and business houses in the country started out as humble family businesses. It's the way India has done business. Join Sonu Bhasin in conversation with stalwarts of Indian family businesses on the Inheritors podcast series by Bloomberg Quint. Discuss the highs and lows, the needs and pressure points of building a business legacy that spans generation.
Welcome back to the Filter Coffee podcast. We're speaking to Akshay Manwani, who's an author, a sports enthusiast, writer, and also a wildlife photographer. Actually, much after that, you started your second book, which was on Nasir Hussain.
Yes.
Similar.
Not the cricketer.
Of course, yeah. But someone who's very different from your previous subject in the sense that he had more control over his environment. Safe to say that?
This is like, you know, I mean, sorry to use a cliche, but it's literally chalk and cheese. Here was Sahir, who was writing this kind of, you know, progressive poetry. It was about communism and egalitarian society. It was about emancipation of women, talking about marginalized sections of society. And then, you know, the subject of my next book is Nasir Hussain, whose, you know, cinema is described as fun, frothy.
Right.
You think of all the 60s films and the heroines running in chiffon saris in, you know, extremely colorful outfits, snow-clad peaks in the background. That was Nasir Hussain's cinema.
Right.
But, you know, in fact, my editor also told me, he says, you know, by the time you finish doing this book, you'll probably be, you know, some kind of, you know, be juggling as to what kind of emotion to carry. Because Sahir is, you know, as the subject is serious, you have to think in terms of what the subject of his poetry is. But this was precisely why I set out to do the Nasir Hussain book. The problem with cinema historians is that there is always a very one-dimensional account that has been given of Hindi cinema. So you basically talk about the 1950s as this, you know, kind of wonderful black and white era where you look back at the films as nation building. So you think of Mehboob Khan's Mother India, you think of Guru Dutt's Pyasa and Kagaz Ke Phool, you think of V. Shantaram and his films, You think of Bimal Roy, Madhumati and Do Bhiga Zameen and all those films. And you think back as, wow, these guys were critiquing the nation state. They were, holding the mirror to Indian society. And then they jump very conveniently to the 1970s and Bachchan and the Angry Young Man and Vendetta and Revenge and all of that.
Do you agree with this commentary on the 50s? Because I don't know about nation building. I personally thought the 50s was the best decade for cinema globally. Right? Like you had extraordinary films being made in the South in the 50s. Hindi, of course, was great. Gurudat happened in the 50s. A big part of Ray happened in the 50s. And out there, Citizen Kane was happening.
Yes.
It's such a vibrant... And when I compare that to today's cinema, I don't even know if we're even matching up.
Yes. So, Karthik, confession over here that I am not, which is why I'm very uncomfortable carrying these, kind of titles which say that, wow, he's a film historian. No, I am just about, you can pass me off as someone who knows a little about Sahir and a little about Nasir Hussain. Right. So I don't know, I don't watch too much of or have watched films outside of Hindi cinema. And when I was writing about the 50s films, yes, I know my 50s films. I know Mehboob Khan's films, Raj Kapoor's films. But, you conveniently have skipped an entire decade, which is the 1960s, and moved, kind of bridged the 50s with the 70s. Yeah. And the problem with that is if you forget what happens right towards the end of the 50s, in fact, this is something that I mentioned in the Nasir Hussain book, that in 1957 is actually a great year in Hindi cinema because it has films like Pyasa, it has Mother India, it has V. Shantaram's Do Aankhein Bhara Haath.
Wow, same year.
Yes, all in the same year. It's a phenomenal year. Okay, but what was interesting to me, which I have written about, is that it also makes the debut of 3 directors who go on and define Hindi cinema right through the 60s and the 70s. And those 3 people there was, of course, the man who's known as, for his middle of the road films, Rishikesh Mukherjee made, I think his first film was Musafir in 1957. Dilip Kumar acted in it. Yes. The second person who directed his first film in 1957 was Vijay Anand with a movie called Naudo Gyara. And then right at the end of 1957, right in the month of December, was Nasir Hussain with Tumsa Nahi Dekha. And all these 3 directors in their own way kind of shape cinema of the 1960s leading into the 1970s. So, then you start thinking that, okay, now, suddenly these 3 directors are, their cinema is very different from Raj Kapoor's films and Mehboob Khan's films and Mother and the kind of films that Guru Dutt was making. And suddenly there is crime in their films, especially Vijay Anand and Nasir Hussain. There's crime, there is outdoor locale, there is, crime happening in the countryside. There are heroines are taking off into Kashmir and all. Shakti Samant is also around that time. I think he made his first film in 55 or 56. So, nobody talks about these directors anymore. You somehow talk about the 50s as a monolith that, there were those 4 directors and there were those 4 directors alone. Right. But there were also these directors who were coming into Hindi cinema. Manmohan Desai made Chaliya in 1960. So one of my attempts through the Nasir Hussain book was that because he was doing fun and frothy cinema, what was being construed as fun and frothy cinema, it didn't mean that it was facile. There was something very important that was happening in Nasir Hussain's films. And that important thing, if I were to summarize it in one line, was that, Hindi cinema always had this problem with Western culture. So, you had Manoj Kumar presenting Western culture and Indian culture as binaries. Right. Okay, so you had Purab or Paschim. The name tells it all. That anything which is Western is going to be problematic. So Western culture would also have a doctor in a movie, but that was acceptable to us. But the moment a lady wore a gown or something which was a dress, a ballroom dress, she would be playing the vamp. Right. The heroine would never be seen wearing those outfits. In fact, just the other day, I was writing a piece that someone has asked me to do, and I was revisiting a scene from this movie called Millie, a 1975 film, Amitabh Bachchan, Jaya Bhaduri, and Aruna Irani, who's the building secretary in the film, she comes in wearing, what is a Western outfit. There's absolutely nothing that can be suggested by, right-wingers as being vile or corrupted. But, she herself is apologetic for what she's wearing. And Nasir Hussain's films kind of were okay with it. The women went out. I mean, you think of Aaja Aaja Main Hoon Pyar Tera, which is happening in that club in Teesri Manzil, which he wrote and produced. It's absolutely okay for the woman to go and dance there while wearing a Western outfit. She's wearing this pink blouse and, tights. Whereas the Hindi film heroine didn't do it. It was only till Parveen Babi and Zeenat Aman came in the 70s that it was okay for women to dance in the club space without being looked upon as vampish figures.
Where did that come from, since you've written about his life and career?
It is, as Jerry Pinto writes in his book, that, Hindi film heroines were seen as, these paragons of virtue. They danced only in white saris and they were supposed to be angelic. Whereas, there was some problem, which is why Helen came to represent everything which was not the Hindi film heroine. So whatever the Hindi film heroine could not do, Helen did.
Right. Did Nasir have sort of a different perspective on this whole thing?
Yeah, in Nasir Hussain's films, the club is a space where the youth go out and have fun. He did not look at it. So one of the things that, again, Hindi cinema has, a problem with is the concept of a hotel. The hotel is the place where the dawn operates from.
The villain's lair.
Yes. If you look at Bazi, Guru Dutt's film Bazi, the villain is operating from within the basement of Star Hotel. Right? If you look at the great Salim Javed films, Diwar, where does Dawar Saab throw that money on the table to Vijay? It happens in a hotel. Where does Vijay meet Samant? In a hotel. Where does Amitabh Bachchan start working for the villainous figure in Shakti? In a hotel. Right? So there was this consistent problem with, the hotel space being the villain's lair.
Actually, yeah.
So Nasir Hussain was like, the hotel was a place where youngsters went out and had fun. In fact, I made this, many people think that in Yadon Ki Baarat, the two songs that are played in the hotel, one is Aapke Kamre Mein Koi Rehta Hai, the longish medley sequence, and the last song, the two songs that come at the end, one is the title song and one is Lekar Hum Deewana Dil. They actually happen in two separate hotel settings. The first hotel has nothing to do with the villain's den. And that's Nasir Hussain's cinema, which is basically his universe, that, this is a place for the youth, of the youth, by the youth.
Right.
Which is why in that sequence, you will see the youth jiving and having fun and raising a glass. And there's nothing wrong about this. But in the second and third song, which is basically Shakal's lair, which is where Lekar Hum Deewana Dil is played out, there is a tinge of red in the song. Right through the song. The song begins with a man getting garroted and, R.D. Burman, in his voice, you hear, ha, and then the song, begins.
Right.
So this is just what, kind of...
Is it also his personal upbringing? Like what we see in a lot of Farhan Akhtar's writing today, right?
Yes.
Is it also, Nasir grew up in a culture like that?
Yeah, and Nasir Hussain came from a very, very, progressive family. I believe this is something I mentioned in the book, his maternal grandmother, if I remember correctly, was the headmistress of schools in Bhopal. His maternal grand uncle was Maulana Azad. And in fact,
I did not know that.
Yes, and in fact, there's this wonderful story about him that when his family, when he came to Bombay, he was staying with some relatives. They got to know that he was writing in cinema, in films, at Filmistan studio over here. Maulana Azad happened to be visiting Bombay at that time, and they told him that Maulana Saab, isko samjhaiye कि ये cinema के लिए लिख रहा है. This is the late 40s where cinema being associated with films was considered a bad thing to do.
I did not know that Amir had a bloodline connection to Azad.
It's true. In fact, I've drawn the family tree at the beginning of the book, which gives the relationship with Maulana Azad. And basically what happened is that these relatives complained and Maulana Azad said, okay, let me speak to the young man. And he asked him, what do you do? So he says, I work in film. So he says, क्या काम करते हो? He says, dialogues लिखता हूँ. So he said, अच्छा dialogues लिखते हो, इसमें कोई बुरी बात नहीं है. That's okay. That's acceptable. Continue doing what you're doing. So, I mean, apart from all the great things that Maulana Azad did towards the freedom struggle and all, I think I owe him a debt for allowing Nasir Hussain to continue in the film industry. Because again, this is a man who was a very integral part of my childhood, as opposed to Sahir's work, which I discovered only much later when I started writing for that website.
Right.
Nasir Hussain's films I grew up on. The Salim Javed films, the Nasir Hussain films were films that I grew up on. When cable television came into India, films like Yadon Ki Baarat and Hum Kisi Se Kam Nahi used to play on loop. And then one, of course, saw that wonderful film which Nasir Hussain's son made, called Jo Jeeta Wahi Sikandar, which was like
Mansoor Khan.
Mansoor Khan, which is like, I've told Mansoor this. It's my top 5 film of all time.
I would tend to agree.
So Nasir Hussain, again, people think of, let's say, Gulzar Saab now. They think of Lata Mangeshkar as having worked for 5-6 decades, and wow, Nasir Hussain came into the world of Hindi cinema, started getting credited from around 1948, 1949, and was writing till he did Akele Hum Akele Tum, the dialogues for Akele Hum Akele Tum in 1995.
Right. And that's a very fascinating thing. I don't know if this is uncommon in Bollywood, but for a writer of that, someone who's capable of that craft, that level of a craft, to also be a producer,
yes,
wasn't very rare.
Phenomenal.
Back then.
He was a writer, he was a director, he was a producer.
He wrote Teesri Manzil.
He wrote Teesri Manzil. He produced Teesri Manzil.
And he wrote Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak.
He wrote Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. He produced Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. In fact, one of the wonderful stories that Amir and Mansoor both told me about Jo Jeeta Wahi Sikandar is that after they had done some 40 days of shooting for Jo Jeeta Wahi Sikandar, they had to actually scrap that, because they had some problems with the cast. The original character which is eventually played by Deepak Tijori was actually being played by Milind Soman.
Oh.
And they shot with Milind Soman, and the lady who plays Ayesha Julka was being played by someone else. And for Pooja Bedi's character, they had got Nagma, who on the day that they were supposed to start shooting with her, she turned it down because she thought that the Vamps role was not what she wanted to make her beginning in Hindi cinema with.
Wow.
So they had to kind of scrap the 40 days that they had done, right. And they managed to get these people, Deepak Tijori and Ayesha Julka, and they reshot it. And he said, we had a huge financial loss. In fact, we didn't make the kind of money that we were hoping because of this kind of scrapping and the money that had gone in. But Mansoor told me this. He said Amir believed so much in that script. He knew that we had a winner on our hands. And then my father, without questioning me, he backed the film as far, not just in terms of being a father, but it was also, he put himself out there as a producer and bankrolled
because of Amir's conviction.
Both of them.
It's mind-boggling, right? Even that early in his career,
exactly.
Amir has his knack of knowing what will work.
Yes, and Jo Jeeta is a winner. It is a winner.
Absolutely, it's a generation.
Yes.
Film, generation-defining film.
Yes.
But talking of convictions, Nasir also had a knack for identifying great talent. Like Pancham, in a way, was discovered by Nasir.
by him.
How did that happen?
Well, not just him. He worked with RD. There's that story that Shami Kapoor actually came back into the Nasir Hussain fold.
I was going to ask you about Shami as well. There was a great relationship.
Yes. Right? So apparently the story goes that something happened. So Nasir Hussain did his first 2 films that he directed with Shami Kapoor, which was Tumsa Nahi Dekha and Dil Deke Dekho. And then apparently there was some misunderstanding, and then Shami Kapoor was expecting a call for the next film, but that didn't happen. He introduced him to Shankar Jaikishan, and then because he got Shankar Jaikishan, he went to Devanand. So there was some kind of misunderstanding, which is why Nasir Hussain went to Devanand and Shami Kapoor went outside of the Nasir Hussain fold. But then what happened is when Nasir Hussain was writing and planning for Teesri Manzil, there was another film also that he was planning with, which released a year later, and this was the film that I discovered when I was researching Nasir Hussain's film. This beautiful black and white film called Baharo Ke Sapne. Right, and what happened is that there was this kind of fallout between Dev Saab and Nasir Hussain, that Nasir Hussain had thought that he would give the black and white film to Devanand's brother, which was Vijay Anand.
Right.
And apparently there was this fallout between the two at a party where Dev Saab said that अरे वो black and white film मेरे भाई को दे रहा है जिसने guide बनाई है और खुद के लिए color film ले रहा है. And Nasir Hussain was apparently so upset with that comment that he said, I'll show you. They had a fight, so Devanand walked out and he said, the black and white film I will direct and I will give Vijay Anand the color film to do, which is Teesri Manzil. Right. So when he went out, Shami Kapoor came back into the Nasir Hussain fold and he did Teesri Manzil. I can't even think of Devanand dancing or putting himself behind the drums like Shami Kapoor, because Shami Kapoor's entire persona was, there was great physicality to it.
Or maybe we'd all remembered Devanand very differently. Hey, but coming back to Akshay Manwani, right?
Yes.
all this is happening. Your two wonderful books are being done, but somewhere while doing all this, sports has been like a big part of your life as well.
Yes.
Right. Did it start in a way with where did it start? Where did your sports writing start?
So again, this was when I decided to quit the corporate world. I was writing these blogs and exchanging emails with friends, and they used to tell me that you should try your hand at writing. You seem to have a good knack for it. So I said, okay, let's try. And I got this contract from AOL back then to do a weekly blog on cricket for the India website. So then, I moved to Bombay when I was starting out researching the Sahir Ludhianvi book, and I managed to get this, kind of gig on the BCCI's website,
Right.
So I worked as a reporter, writer, assistant editor on that website. And I covered the IPL, I covered the 2011 Cricket World Cup that we won. I covered what was then the Champions League T20, which was, that 3-week tournament, which was played in September, October.
Yes.
So I worked on 2 editions of that also. But cricket was again, a love that one had as a child growing up. I mean, I have, kind of not studied for my exams because I was watching India-Pakistan or a pivotal India-Australia game. I have kind of followed ball by ball, even the most boring test match days. And simultaneously, there was also a love for basketball. I find that very difficult to explain simply because this is.
But you couldn't have grown up with basketball, right? We didn't get to see that.
No, so that's precisely my point. I find it very hard to explain. So the only thing that I can say is that I grew a love for the sport was because my father used to travel a lot to the US, and every time he went there, he used to get us these cool sneakers, and we used to live very close to our school, and somehow strangely our school was heavily invested in basketball. So when they put up these, fiberglass boards, Don Bosco in Delhi, in Alaknanda.
Right.
So we always were known for having a good basketball team. So, and I used to live literally walking distance from the school. So, I was one of those kids who would, kind of wake up at 7:15 when the school bell was 7:25.
Right.
Okay. And just just rush because you could make it. So I had a good opportunity every evening to go out there and play ball also. So that's how the basketball affair grew. And then
I'm pretty sure the principal of Don Bosco, Alaknanda, would be very, very thrilled to know that one of their students is now the NBA commentator.
Yeah, in fact, after many years, my PT teacher got in touch with me one fine day. Randomly, I got a call from an unknown number, and he said, "मैं Dhaiya sir बोल रहा हूँ." And I was like, well, how did you get my number? And he says, forget how did I get your number, but it's such a proud moment to see you there on television.
Wow.
It was touching in a sense because, I mean, I never believed when I was a child and I was consuming the sport and I was, my greatest role model in my life is Michael Jordan. So
I was going to come to that. Yeah.
So I never imagined that one fine day I'll be kind of covering the sport, talking about it. I've been extremely lucky, I would say.
Lovely. So how does it? Did you record in Bombay?
Yes. Basically, I do live Hindi commentary.
Right.
I've also trained the commentators who the NBA kind of bought on board, because those are commentators from they're basically doing commentary across various sports. Kabaddi, when the Asian Games happens or the Olympics happen next year in Tokyo, those commentators are like a pool of commentators. They aren't NBA commentators. So I've had training sessions with them, formalized training sessions where I've, over a 2-day program every year, thrice a year, I have kind of trained them on the nuances of the game. What are the fouls? Who are the star players? How do you call a particular play? The technicalities of it. So earlier when we started out, our commentators didn't even know what is a 3-pointer and what is a 2-point shot. And today they can, use hardcore technical stuff like Euro step and from inside the arc and from 35 feet. And it's hugely professionally been satisfying. The problem is that to explain this dichotomy to someone that I am also someone who's familiar with the Urdu Shairi of Sahir Ludhianvi.
Yes.
And I also know who Tim Duncan is and what is his relevance to the San Antonio Spurs. Bridging that dichotomy is a far bigger challenge for me.
You might want to take the Nasir Hussain route on that just to make sure the sports wins. But what is your take on where we are? Like, for example, many years back, it's very, very rarely that I'll get to speak about the Spurs or for that matter, any of them, Lebron or anybody, in a social setting, right? Now I think we're probably much behind football as a sport, basketball. But what's your take on where basketball is in the country?
So I think one of the things that I have seen personally is that the NBA has invested significant amount of resources, money, effort in growing the game in India. So I have now, as we head into the 2019-20 NBA season, which begins in 2 days' time, this would be my 8th season of being associated with the NBA.
Wow.
So the first 4 seasons I was writing for them. There was 1 season where I edited their website also, and then the last 3 seasons I've been doing Hindi commentary for them. I knew them when they were a 2-man team in Bombay City operating from a 1-room office in Bandra Kurla complex. That 2-room team became a 10-man team, and they moved to the Lower Parel office, which they moved out of only last year. In 2018 and now they're almost a 25-member team at a sprawling office in 1 BKC. And with that has come in the television coverage has enhanced. It's not just the number of games that they're showing nowadays. You get to see 2 games every day. You are able to get commentary in Hindi on the weekends. Besides that, we just had the NBA India games. For the first time ever, 2 NBA teams, the Sacramento Kings and the Indiana Pacers, came to NSCI and Worli in Bombay and played 2 preseason games on the 4th and 5th of October. You've had a mushrooming of merchandising availability on these various online forums. You've had coaching clinics being organized for the youth through the Reliance Foundation Junior NBA program, and I think that itself is estimated to have touched about 15 million kids in India. You've had coaching clinics being conducted. So it's not just in terms of the NBA providing contact point for the sport through television, but all through all these initiatives.
Grassroots level.
I mean, even a film like Half Girlfriend, where I think the male character, I haven't seen the film, but the male character is a basketball player. The training for Arjun Kapoor's character was provided for by the NBA. So they, really? Anything that they can do to, kind of provide another contact point for the Indian audience. Because you may not necessarily be an NBA fan, but you might be someone who's focused on fitness and keeping yourself athletic, and the NBA is a sport that you should follow. Then in that case,
talking of which, we could use a good basketball film in Hindi.
Exactly. We've already had a documentary film made on the first Indian who was drafted into the NBA, Satnam Singh Bhamra. I think it was called. It came on Netflix. It was called 1 in a Billion. I've seen the film. It's really well made. So, you have all these things that they've done in the last 8 or 9 years. They've put themselves out there. They opened only the 5th of its kind academy in the world called the NBA India Academy, which was started in 2017 May in Noida. And it's basically full scholarship paid program for 24 boys, which eventually...
This is the kind of program that had a great impact when it was launched in China, right?
I think they now have NBA academies across the world. China, I think, alone has 4 such academies, and I think now there are a few in Australia as well. But I know for a fact that when they launched the NBA India Academy in Noida in 2017, that was only the 5th of its kind. Wow, so imagine, wonderful. You have these boys who are, they're staying, they're lodging, their education is paid for. So it's just a great, launching pad that go out there, play the sport and something that you love, and, don't worry about all the accompanying things. Like, when you and I were probably growing up, my parents would tell me that, switch off the TV. Why are you watching all this? Go back and get down to Newton's law of gravity.
Yes.
So
hey, but who are you rooting for this year?
So I'm not a...
I know it's a wrong question to ask for a commentator, but...
I am basically a huge... I don't know if you're familiar with this player called Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Of course.
So I'm basically now a Milwaukee fan. And I just absolutely love Giannis. I love his story. The fact that, he's the son of Nigerian, parents, but was born and raised in Greece, or at least was raised in Greece. And, has come out through that, a struggling kind of background and then made it through to the NBA. I read a terrific story about how he used to literally wear the sneakers that were handed down to him by the people who were playing at the court or the club that he used to play at.
Right.
And there were times when he played with wearing a couple of sizes smaller than what his actual shoe size is. But, he was just happy to have those shoes so that he could go out there and play basketball.
Extraordinary story.
Absolutely.
Actually, this was fascinating. I look forward to this season's commentary, and somewhere I'll look out for a reference to something that Ludhianvi wrote. Right.
Of course.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Karthik. Pleasure.
Cheers. So that was our show. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
Look, up in the internet. It's a meme. No, it's a cat video. No, it's the Geek Fruit Podcast.
That's right. We interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, the Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.